Hello everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I want to compare Final Fantasy XIV's 3 tank jobs, the Paladin, Warrior, and Dark Knight. We'll be looking at the pros and cons of each of them to help better understand how they stack up against, and with, one another. Quick disclaimer, all 3 tanks are viable within the game's meta. This video should not dissuade you from playing the tank you enjoy, though hopefully it helps you pick one if you're thinking about picking up tanking for the first time. First, let's start with one of Final Fantasy XIV's 2 veteran tank jobs, the Paladin. As a holy protector of the royal family of Ul'dah, this job is the game's premier sword and board tank. With unmatched defensive capabilities, the Paladin is one of the most approachable jobs for newer tanks. While all 3 tanks can parry, the Paladin's shield gives it the added ability to block, mitigating even more damage. This extra defense is furthered by the use of their many defensive cooldowns. Rampart reduces damage by 20% and Sentinel by 40%. Bulwark increases their chance to block, and Sheltron ensures the next attack will be blocked as well as restoring MP. They can increase healing received with Convalescence, blind weaker opponents using Flash, and prevent weaker opponents from using abilities with Shield Swipe. They can prevent taking critical damage with Awareness, cover an ally to redirect physical damage to themselves, prevent being knocked around the arena using Tempered Will, and outright becoming 100% invincible to most attacks for a short duration using Hallowed Ground. They even come stacked with Clemency, a super high potency heal that can also heal the Paladin if used on an ally, and Divine Veil, which grants all nearby party members a damage absorbing shield when a single magical cure is cast on the Paladin by a party member. It's easy to see why the Paladin's high defensive capabilities are so valued, but they also bring strong raid utility and some offensive flair as well. Shield Bash can allow a Paladin to spam stuns on the targets, though it comes at a high resource cost. Spirits Within deals higher damage the higher the Paladin's health is, as well as silencing an enemy's spells. Fight or Flight increases the Paladin's physical damage dealt, and Rage of Halone can apply a debuff that reduces the opponent's strength by 10%, thus reducing the amount of physical damage that they deal. The final big thing they're capable of doing is switching between Shield Oath and Sword Oath. They can only have one of these oaths up at a time, and they each have different effects. Sword Oath causes the Paladin's auto attacks to deal additional damage, while Shield Oath acts as their premier tank stance. Every tank has one of these stances, and they all slightly differ in their effects. Shield Oath reduces the damage taken by the Paladin, while also decreasing the damage they deal. And it also increases the amount of enmity, or threat, that the Paladin generates, and increases their chance to hit by 5%. The Paladin also has access to cross-class skills of Marauder and Conjurer. From Marauder, Paladins usually take Bloodbath for a small amount of personal healing, Foresight for another small defensive cooldown to pair with something else, and Mercy Stroke for some additional damage and the potential heal from the Execute. Fracture is sometimes taken for DPS, but this isn't too common due to its high DP cost. As for a Conjurer, most Paladins just take Stone Skin, which grants them another use for their MP outside of Flash, their Oaths, and Clemency. Casting Stone Skin on yourself or an ally strategically can lighten the burden on healers, but it has to be used correctly. So the pros of the job are fairly obvious. It has unmatched personal defensive capabilities, especially when looking at Hallowed Ground, which is often used to outright bypass mechanics in fights. They also have decent raid-wide mitigation and healing in the form of Divine Veil, Cover, and Clemency. They excel against enemies that deal primarily physical damage, as it not only allows them to block the attacks, but they're able to reduce their damage further with Rage of Halone. The ability to chain stun a single enemy or multiple enemies also sees a lot of use, though it depends on the fight. And to top it all off, the Paladin is generally considered the easiest tank to pick up and learn. The job does have its fair share of cons though. For one, it has abysmal AoE damage, as its only form of AoE damage comes from Circle of Scorn, which is a dot that barely accounts for anything. The job also loses some of its utility when bosses deal primarily magic damage, especially if their auto attacks are magic damage, as you cannot block magical attacks, rendering Sheltron, Bulwark, Shield Swipe, and the ability to block entirely useless. Rage of Halone also won't reduce the damage of magical attacks, so not only in that case, but even if a boss is dealing some physical damage to the tank, it requires a Monk or a Dark Knight to reduce the magical damage properly. And finally, while the Paladin can deal a decent amount of single target damage, not to be underestimated, it has a hard time keeping up with the other 2 tanks in the damage department. This, combined with potential TP issues in long drawn out fights, can make things a bit rough on the Paladin at times. If you like being a wall of defense, however, this job will fulfill that feeling in earnest. Next up, we have the Warrior. This berserker with an axe is just as much about offense as it is about defense, and striking the right balance between the two will unlock its full potential. The warrior's tank stance, Defiance, grants quite a few different effects from the Paladin's Shield Oath. While it still increases enmity, hit chance, and reduces the damage that the warrior itself deals, it replaces the reduced damage taken on Shield Oath with increasing the warrior's maximum health by 25%, increasing the amount of healing they receive by 20%, as well as unlocking the job's Wrath mechanic. Several abilities on the warrior grant stacks of Wrath. Each stack on its own increases the warrior's chance to parry, and at 5 stacks, several abilities become accessible at the cost of expending all 5 of your Wrath stacks. Inner Beast deals high damage, heals the warrior for 100% of the damage dealt, and grants a 20% damage reduction for a short time. Steel Cyclone deals high damage in an AoE, and Unchained removes the damage reduction effect from Defiance for a short time, allowing the warrior to easily deal high damage while retaining the safety of their Defiance stance. Finally, in case of emergency, or for more damage, you have Infuriate, which instantly grants the warrior 5 Wrath stacks on a short cooldown. The warrior isn't a one-trick pony though, and brings a share of defensive and offensive abilities. Vengeance reduces damage taken by 30%, and also deals damage back to any enemy physically attacking the warrior. This ability has synergy with Bloodbath, which heals the warrior every time it deals physical damage, causing it to be a self-healing machine when up against a lot of enemies. Berserk increases the warrior's attack power by 50%, which, by the way, is basically equivalent to granting them 50% more strength for its duration. Though it stops them from attacking for 5 seconds when it wears off, that effect can be removed by healers or a well-timed bard song. Mercy Stroke allows the warrior to deal execute damage more frequently than when other jobs cross-class the skill, and Brutal Swing can be used as a stun or as additional damage, though only once every 20 seconds. Maim increases the warrior's damage dealt by 10% and can then be comboed into one of 2 other utilities, Storm's Eye or Storm's Path. Storm's Eye decreases the opponent's slashing resistance by 10%, causing ninjas and all tanks to deal 10% more damage, and Storm's Path reduces all damage the enemy actually does by 10%. Thrill of Battle allows the warrior to increase their max health and heal themselves for the same amount for a short time. Raw Intuition allows them to parry every attack coming from the front for a short time, though if an enemy lands an attack from any place other than the front, it will be a guaranteed crit. Equilibrium is a massive self-heal on a short cooldown, and Holmgang allows the warrior to lock its opponent and itself in place for 6 seconds, while also ensuring the warrior cannot fall below 1 health during this time, essentially acting as the warrior's equivalent of hollowed ground. And like I said before, the warrior isn't all about defense. When Defiance isn't necessary, warriors can switch into their Deliverance stance. Deliverance increases the warrior's damage dealt by 5%, and doesn't have any of the weaknesses or strengths of Defiance, it's just that 5% boost. It does, however, enable the ability to gain stacks of Abandon, which each grant the warrior 2% critical hit chance and stack up to 5. These stacks are interchangeable with Wrath stacks, meaning if you have 5 Abandon stacks and then switch into Defiance, you would immediately have 5 Wrath stacks and vice versa. These Abandon stacks can also be expended to grant the warrior access to several powerful offensive abilities. Fell Cleave is definitely the most popular, dealing massive damage to a single target. The other attack, Decimate, just deals high damage in an AoE. While these are the only 2 abilities you unlock via expending your 5 Abandon stacks, just being in Deliverance changes Equilibrium to grant TP instead of HP, and Infuriate to instead grant 5 Abandon stacks. Warrior's cross-class skills are taken from Gladiator and Pugilist. From Gladiator, it's considered mandatory to take Provoke. Convalescence and Awareness are also good for endgame rating. From Pugilist, Second Wind and Internal Release are the most common, synergizing with the already high crit chance of the job in Deliverance, while also granting them another self-heal. Sometimes, you'll see warriors take Featherfoot or Mantra, but this is rare and it really depends on the fight and what you need. Now, the pros of the warrior are extremely numerous. Their higher health pool and healing received from Defiance synergize well with Stone Skin, Eloquium, and Nocturnal Shield effects to grant them high mitigation when healers are helping out. They have great self-healing from Inner Beast, Bloodbath, and Equilibrium. It won't make them invincible, but it doesn't hurt either. Their defensive cooldowns, especially Inner Beast, can give them very good mitigation from attacks from the bosses that do burst damage. Storm's Path and Storm's Eye also grant great raid-wide damage and defensive boost. Since Storm's Eye increases the damage of all the other tanks as well as ninjas, it can be great for increasing outgoing damage. And Storm's Path, unlike the Paladin and the Dark Knight, will reduce all damage dealt from the boss by 10%, regardless of whether it's physical or magical. Equilibrium while in Deliverance gives them incredible sustained damage in fights, giving them a near infinite TP source. And speaking of Deliverance, warriors are just capable of dealing extremely high damage, often rivaling actual DPS if the warrior is never forced to actually tank. On the other hand, the cons of the warrior are few and far between, as their strengths generally make up for their weaknesses. I mean, since they don't have a shield, they're incapable of blocking, but they have increased parry chance from Wrath Stacks and they have raw intuition. On top of the self-healing, it's a generally overlooked weakness. They also don't have the ability to silence opponents, and its stun is on a longer cooldown than the Paladin, so it can't stun lock an enemy as well as the Paladin can. Holmgang is also noticeably weaker than Hallowed Ground, as it requires a nearby enemy to use, prevents the warrior from moving for its duration, lasts 4 seconds shorter than Hallowed Ground, and doesn't stop the damage altogether, just ensures that the warrior won't die for those 6 seconds. They will still require healing attention after those 6 seconds, or before the effect wears off to make sure they don't die. On the bright side, at least it can be used to mitigate knockbacks, akin to Tempered Will. The job's only real weakness is that it requires a high degree of skill to make use of its full tools. Being comfortable with fights to know when you can tank in Deliverance and when it's optimal to be in Defiance, having proper timing with your inner beasts with the boss's strong abilities, making sure you line up your other cooldowns properly, all of these things can make the job seem scarier to approach for newer players. But if you get past those weaknesses, dive into learning the ins and outs of the jobs, you'll find yourself smiling every single time you land a Fellcleave crit. The final job to talk about is Dark Knight, the latest addition to Final Fantasy XIV's tank roster. As a Defender of the Weak, the job combines its proficiency of the Greatsword with its ability to tap into magic known as the Darkness. The powers of darkness cost MP to access, and thus, this job actively deals with a high degree of resource management compared to its predecessors. It is a mix of defensive abilities that can function against either physical or magical attacks, as well as a fast-paced playstyle when off-tanking and dealing damage. As a tank, Dark Knight's defensive stance is known as Grit. It acts similarly to Shield Oath, while also granting access to additional power elsewhere in their kit. What's unique about Dark Knight is that their offensive stance, Dark Side, can and should be active at the same time Grit is active. It increases the Dark Knight's damage dealt by 15%, almost mitigating Grit's damage reduction. It also grants access to a number of the Dark Knight's most powerful offensive and defensive abilities. The catch is that it slowly drains your MP and prevents outside sources such as Bards, Machinists, or Astrologians from helping to regenerate it. It's all up to the Dark Knight to manage and regenerate their own MP properly to make use of Darkside. One of the strongest abilities it grants access to is Dark Arts, which greatly enhances the power of certain other skills, at the cost of a large chunk of MP. We'll be referring to this ability a lot when talking about the Dark Knight's utility and cooldowns. Dark Knight shares similarities with the other two tanks in what defensive cooldowns are available. Shadow Skin is similar to Rampart, while Shadow Wall is similar to Vengeance, minus the physical counter, once a 20% and once a 30% damage reduction. Dark Dance increases parry chance and can also increase evasion if combined with Dark Arts beforehand. The parry aspect of Dark Dance also synergizes with two other Dark Knight abilities. Reprisal is an attack only accessible after parrying that deals damage and reduces all the damage the enemy deals by 10%. Low Blow is a stun akin to Brutal Swing, though it's on a slightly longer cooldown. However, parries have a chance at resetting the cooldown on Low Blow, which can be used to chain stun a single enemy or multiple enemies when tanking large packs and deal additional damage. Blood Price allows Dark Knights to regenerate MP for every hit they take while under its effect, adding to their MP management. Dark Mind acts as a unique defensive cooldown for the Dark Knight, reducing magic damage taken for its duration, with the effect strengthened by Dark Arts. Then, they have their Hallowed Ground / Holmgang equivalent skill, Living Dead. This places the Dark Knight in a prepared state of Living Dead for a short time. If the Dark Knight takes fatal damage during that time, they enter the Walking Dead state. At this point, if they receive heals totaling their full health within the Walking Dead debuff, they will live. If not, they will die. To be clear, they don't need to be brought to full health. They just need to receive heals equal to their maximum health in total. This can cause Walking Dead to wear off even if a Dark Knight is only at 50% HP, assuming they were taking damage while they were receiving healing. The Dark Knight also offers unique raid utility in aspects outside of its defensive cooldowns. For one, it has the ability Plunge, which is the only tank ability that acts as a gap closer to jump to nearby targets, granting them enhanced mobility. Delirium can be applied and is the opposite of Rage of Halone, reducing the target's intelligence by 10%. This can make them great to have if no monk is available in the group to reduce raid-wide magic damage. Soul Eater also absorbs 100% of the damage dealt as health, and with Dark Arts has a massive potency boost to make it one of the hardest hitting tank skills in the game. Dark Passenger deals damage in a line in front of the Dark Knight and can also blind targets hit if Dark Arts is used. Salted Earth allows them to place an AoE on the ground that deals damage to enemies, and Abyssal Drain allows them to deal high enmity to a group of enemies and absorb health when paired with Dark Arts. Soul Survivor can be placed on enemies, and if they die while it is placed on them, will grant health and MP to the Dark Knight. Carve and Spit can be used to either regenerate MP or deal extremely high damage while under the effect of Dark Arts. Finally, they have Blood Weapon, which is only accessible when not in the Grit stance. It greatly enhances the Dark Knight's attack speed and grants them MP for each hit they land while under its effect. The Dark Knight's cross-class skills come from the classes of the other two tanks, Marauder and Gladiator. Gladiator's Provoke is once again mandatory, with Convalescence and Awareness being solid secondary choices. From the Warrior, Foresight and Mercy Stroke are taken quite often. Bloodbath is still an option and one that most Dark Knights will use in endgame raiding, though keep in mind that the Dark Knight's AoE skills are all magic damage and don't benefit from Bloodbath, so it really works best when combined with single target damage to add to their self-sustain. So with all the major utilities out of the way, let's talk about the pros of the Dark Knight. First off, they have increased mobility due to Plunge, that's a given. Another obvious one is their ability to counter magic damage, both in the use of Dark Mind and Delirium. This can make them super effective on bosses that deal primarily high magic damage. The job also has exceptionally high enmity generation when played properly, due to their abundance of off-global cooldown skills and their ability to enhance the enmity generation of their enmity combo using Dark Arts. Dark Knight has exceptional self-sustain when main tanking, since more than often, Dark Knights like to pair Dark Arts with Soul Eater for its insane damage value. On top of the sustain, they have several consistent forms of damage mitigation, on top of their tank stance, natively reducing damage taken. And finally, the job has extremely high DPS. At times, it can seem comparable to a Warrior sustained DPS, but it still comes second place to them, fitting somewhere between Warrior and Paladin. However, the cons of the job may seem more numerous than the other two tanks. While the job itself performs absolutely fine in content, its design seems a bit disjointed at times. It has abilities that rely on parries and getting hit, but then has abilities that increase evasion or blind foes. In fact, one major weakness is that its arguably best debuff skill, Reprisal, is locked away behind parrying, meaning that it's inaccessible when off-tanking unless an ad spawns that triggers a parry. The job also suffers from resource starvation. While MP can be self-managed indefinitely once a Dark Knight understands a fight, they have no means of slowing their TP consumption or getting it back. This can cause them to hit their TP floor faster than almost any other job in the game, especially when compared to the other two tanks. When Blood Weapon is being used, the job burns through this finite pool even faster, so expect to ask for a goad or payon sometime during long fights. And finally, Living Dead is the most stressful skill of all of the ultimate defensive cooldowns, especially when you look at Hallowed Ground, with less overall utility. Its strength lies in the fact that it has a 10-second period in which it can be activated, unless it can be used well in advance to prepare for an imminent death. However, the additional stress put on the healers, as well as the fact that failure to counter the death cheat will result in death anyway, makes it a more complex skill with less overall effectiveness. Despite all of this, the Dark Knight can stand up there right with the other two tanks, and compete on the highest level. It's just also badass to use a big sword. So ultimately, this is a versus video, so I should pick a first, second, and third place tank, though it's just talking about my personal favorite. Well, if that's the case, I'd actually like to start with first place. Seems pretty obvious, but my first place choice is the Warrior. The job's broad utility, high damage, self-sustain, and overall reliability is just too good to pass up. It can enhance the damage of the other tanks, something both the other tanks can't do, and also reduces the damage from all attacks from the boss, regardless of main or off tanking. Yes, you do have skills that do similar things, such as Reprisal for the Dark Knight, but it relies on you being a main tank. And also, Storm's Path is just all damage. It doesn't matter if it's physical or magical. It's one of the strongest jobs in the game thus far, and among the 3 tanks is currently the dominant force when played correctly. As for second and third place, Paladin and Dark Knight are both fairly even in my book. One fills the role of a more physical type tank, while the other has unique magical resistances. While the Paladin is a steady and reliable job with less damage, the Dark Knight is a bit more chaotic and does more damage. They both have their merits and demerits, and it can fit cleanly alongside each other or a warrior. It's just all about understanding the limits of these jobs and how to use their strength to protect your party or deal more damage. It's also worth mentioning that considering party composition can also change which one you use. For example, if you have a monk available, you may be more comfortable bringing a paladin, using its defensive tools and then allowing your party to deal more damage as opposed to your tank, which will be dealing less damage. If you don't have a monk available, Dark Knight becomes a serious consideration, and since it does more damage, it just requires the healers to get used to healing the slightly more, again, chaotic tank. Like I said, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, but generally, the warrior just seems to jump ahead of both of them. Now my question is, what do you think about the 3 tanks in Final Fantasy XIV? Are you on my side with warriors being hands down the best tank? By the way, Felcleave is awesome. Or are you more of a fan of the Paladin or Dark Knight? Would you give one a solid second place and a solid third place? Just let me know what you think in the comment section of the video below. Anyway, thank you for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I will see you in the next Versus video, hopefully coming soon. Anyway, until then, take care.